So thanks, and thanks. I should say thanks to, especially to all the organizers, but in particular Reese. I think this is a really important topic. My background is really actually I'm trained in philosophy, and so ethics is something near and dear to my heart. But so I'm actually going to be talking. I'm going to zoom right in. So I'm going to be talking about, so my title here is Guiding Principles for Ethical Cryptocurrency, Blockchain, and DLT Research. And I got all three of those in there to be inclusive, and I'll say why in a second. But specifically, I'm going to be talking about research ethics, and maybe even research and development ethics. So not whether or not we should do Bitcoin, or whether or not we should overthrow the state, or all these interesting ethical and political questions, but rather about picking up on this theme around this field building summit, this idea that if we as a community, if we're going to try to push this forward, we need to sort of get our house in order. So that's where I'm zooming into just kind of research ethics here. So the conclusion where I kind of end up is basically I think we actually have a challenge, a real challenge ahead of us because we research what I sort of just call value technologies. And this, as you'll see through my examples and stuff, this means everything we do is a lot more difficult than traditional research ethics questions. And so, and I'll come back to this point. And there's a paper that this is associated with. I won't go into, it's built on this sort of this theoretical model of what I call contagion through technology. So it's picking up some of the literature around innovation contagion and ethical contagion. So what did I do? I basically had, I did sort of a two-part empirical study here. The first was just a lit analysis, and I'll just sort of as a side note mention this little project I work on called the Blockchain Research Network, which is where I pulled my literature data from. Right now it's, at this point, it seems to be the last research bibliography standing. So this is something that might be of value to the research ecosystem. This is why I maintain it. Right now, there's about 3,000 books and articles in there specific to crypto. In the next, it's never quite lived up to its the vision I had for it. But you'll see, in the next, if you follow along, the Blockchain Research Network. In the next couple months, hopefully, some things are going to be changing, and it'll be a more substantial part of the research ecosystem. So, anyways, I analyzed. At the time, it was just a little over 2,000 items. I looked for research methods that are described, so I can pick these up, and that's reduced the number down to 79. And then in the end, we have 22 with ethical disclosure, and I'll go into this in a second. And then the other part, I went and I surveyed active researchers. And here, active was just the simple measure of if you have 2 items on the Blockchain Research Network, it's a good signal for me that you're a very active kind of researcher. So ended up with 32 complete responses, 17% response rate. Important to note here, these are not really robust numbers, but I don't take this to be a problem because this is not science in the sense of some sort of rigor towards truth. We're talking about the squishy world of ethics. And so this is very much descriptive ethics, right? At the end, I'm going to present a couple guiding principles where I'm going to sort of give my normative position, but really it's descriptive ethics. So this is what the community takes themselves to be doing from an ethical perspective. And so I ended up analyzing these sort of 6 ethical themes. I'll go into that. So the first one is the literature analysis, just to give you kind of a snapshot of this is really just a bouncing off place for me to look at the kinds of methods that are used. Why methods are important is there's a saying in research ethics that your methods determine your ethics. And this is particularly, I'll point out, the stuff around active and passive measurement. So those people that are in the community of, particularly it's big in the computer security community, measurement studies are going through a lot of challenging ethical issues right now, generally for computer security, and we'll see them reemerge in our community with kind of a vengeance. So from the survey itself, so I kind of took that and I said, okay, all the people that answered my survey, what are the kind of research methods you use? Here they sort of are. You'll see that there's sort of a general mix, but there's a good chunk of sort of computer science folks in there, as well as just your average, humanities people. So the issues that kind of emerge out of this are varied, and these are just the kind of ones I thought to be the most salient. So the first is, are people aware of their ethics guidelines? If you work at a university, you're subject to ethics guidelines, whether you want to be or not. Usually in the United States, they call them IRBs, but every country around the world has some version of this. And as it turns out, pretty much everyone knows about these guidelines. There might also be association guidelines and other places that ethical research guidelines come into play. However, as it turns out, IRB in particular is not well used, specifically by the computer science engineering field. This is not to place blame, because in fact, actually, there's a large body of literature within, particularly again, the computer security community around the inappropriateness of IRB for what they're doing. They say everything from IRBs don't understand my research methods, so they're not being informative here. In fact, I've even spoke with computer security researchers who say there's now a trend within the journal literature that says you need to have IRB. So they say, okay, great, and they go to their IRB and they say, I want to do some, I want to do some security testing or something like this, or I want to do some active measurement. And IRB says this does not count as traditional human subject research. There's not like a human subject you're studying, right? So get out of here. We're not going to do IRB, which actually puts them in an interesting bind because they can't publish, because now there's this big move towards doing ethical research within these communities, but IRB is not sufficiently educated about to be able to inform them. So it's a real problem. So it's not to place blame, it's a problem. Okay. Another issue I looked into was how we're kind of, especially when the theme of building a field here, how are we teaching those that are coming up, through the PhDs and postdocs and all this sort of thing. As it turns out, computer science teachers in particular, I think relatively encouragingly, 66% said they taught ethics. 10% use formal guidelines, so there's kind of a lot of ad hoc sort of stuff there. That's not a big surprise. The formal guidelines aren't very helpful in this regard. Software vulnerability disclosure is a big issue. I'm going to return to this, but basically lots of the security researchers, those that identified as security researchers, found bugs. They all disclosed them. Interestingly, only 38% were compensated. If you're familiar with this literature around vulnerabilities, there is a lot of movement towards creating markets around these to kind of induce the sorts of disclosure practices we'd like to see. And so that's actually, I would suggest, a relatively low number for being compensated for disclosures. Okay, a big issue, obviously, is token ownership and disclosure. So as it turns out, 47% of the people bought tokens for research, and there's a pretty big variance for experience, so which is not so surprising. Those with a little more experience perhaps are a little more willing to take risks with respect to their research methods. What I found really interesting is the computer scientists and the engineers were very comfortable with buying tokens for personal use. Now, the problem is they're also not disclosing this. So they're making money. 38% of them earned profit. 6% disclose their ownership in research publications, and 16% online. So that's to say most of the stuff you're reading has a conflict of interest lying behind it. Just like a prima facie conflict of interest, an obvious one, right? And also industry relations were not well disclosed either. And to break that one out a little bit more, almost half of people are working with the industry, which arguably is good, but of course it introduces these conflict of interest issues. And the reasons why they're working with industry I thought was very interesting. Reputation is a fairly significant marker here. And I think if you have worked in this nexus, you will be familiar with the ways that reputation gets kind of bought. If you're a startup, there's nothing better than to get a couple of MIT professors on your advisory board who may or may not do anything, but they sure as heck do give you that nice patina of, you know, of innovation and you know, and all that good kind of reputation stuff. Okay, so a little bit of discussion around these sort of 6 themes. I'm going to break out 3 issues. And in the paper itself, I talk a lot, draw comparisons with traditional research ethics. So the first is conflicts of interest. So here we have similar conflicts of interest to any other field, particularly those that have commercial applications, right? So we see, you know, pharma or ag or any of these, you know, big fields with these challenges. As I mentioned, there seems to be kind of a halo effect used for reputation. There's a number of Nobel laureates that are working for startups, and you see a lot of discussion of this kind of notion of buying these sort of the reputation of these top universities. An interesting feature here is that there seems to be a kind of pay-to-play phenomenon going on here for a lot of research. And so what I mean by this is particularly people who want to do a kind of a practical-minded bit of research, you basically need to buy some tokens, right, to be able to do that kind of research. If you want to do, see if you can manipulate a market, well, what do you need to do? The first thing you need to do is go buy some Bitcoin or whatever and see if you can manipulate market. If you want to buy drugs online and see how that works out, that's the step you need to do. These are, I'm quoting actual studies that, of course, have been done. But that's a real challenge. So there's, how do you resolve this issue around this pay-to-play, right? Another big one is these risky research methods. So there's a number of formal guidelines that have been developed within specific communities to help them out. We have general, you know, there's ACM, you know, ethics guidelines, these sorts of things. We've got more specific ones like the Menlo Report. If you belong to particular associations, be it well, not I was going to say economists, but actually economists quite famously don't have a code of ethics. But if you're an anthropologist, there is, you know. So you might be subject to guidelines anyways. We, of course, don't have any of that, right? And so I think this is an important part of this field building that we need to kind of consider. So some of the research methods we're using actually are pretty dangerous. I'd like to point out the big one for me is this what's called passive and active measurement. So this is going out and looking at people on the network, right? You could study to see how transactions are being made and so on and so forth. Active measurement being where you actually induce the behavior you're looking for. So you don't just sort of naturalistically study it, but rather you create it and then study it, right? So you're almost like a chemist in a lab. And I think the experiment and lab notion here is a valuable one to think about. So of course, one of the problems is consent. This is a problem that exists anytime you're doing internet research, right? But it's definitely a problem here. It's a big problem because often you're going to be exposing illegal activities. You're literally going to be seeing people buying drugs, right? Now, this is a problem if you do de-anonymizing research, because you are potentially exposing your research subjects without their consent to their very, you know, sort of dicey, in many cases, illegal kinds of behavior. And then there's also this risk of dual use or misuse of research methods. And so this is a picture I took from Ari's talk yesterday. And this is not to place blame on what they were doing, but it's a great example of the sorts of challenges that you can have with your research that become basically unintended consequences. So I mentioned de-anonymization. There are cases in which de-anonymization research has actually been then taken up by law enforcement for their obvious reasons of what they're doing. So if you're doing this research, you need to think very carefully about how your research methods might be reused or misused. And similarly, Ari was talking about how they unintentionally created the bot community with a blog post, right? This is not that they intended to, but this is a consequence of them doing this research. And then the other one is Philip Dian's Twitter quote or Twitter survey up there. So very not scientific, but polled the community and asked whether or not it was okay to break production, mainnet smart contracts in a classroom assignment. So this is one of these tensions, of course, the computer security community has to deal with this all the time. Do you teach hackers in the classroom, and how do you kind of do this appropriately? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but because security through obscurity is not the answer, but it's obviously very dangerous. And one of the reasons, of course, why it's so dangerous here, and more so than your average, teach a kid how to hack situation, is because this is value itself. You're not just breaking into a social network or some other system which may be relatively important. You're literally teaching them how to break into the bank. So that changes the situation from an ethical perspective. And then finally, disclosure practices are particularly challenging for us. So to draw a comparison, there's this famous case of this hematologist at the University of Toronto who disclosed adverse drug effects. This is one of these famous ethics cases, right? And the drug companies did not much care for her disclosing these adverse effects and attacked her, and actually University of Toronto just piled in on it as well. And so it was her reputation was severely tarnished by doing the right thing of making these disclosures, right? We have the same kind of issue, and again, perhaps even more so than these other communities. So Corey Fields, sort of many of you will be quite familiar with this sort of famous case of finding a vulnerability in Bitcoin Cash, where he basically had to report the vulnerability anonymously because he felt that if the vulnerability had been used prior to his discovery of it, he'd have no way of saying, no, that wasn't me, right? So, which is all to say that vulnerability disclosure in crypto is not up to the task at all. And so we have this sort of little thing by Imogen Sears who says it's a choose your own security disclosure adventure. So it's a real problem that these, dealing with these critical assets, these critical systems, we don't have the kind of disclosure practices necessary. And then there's the no-coiner solution, which is just don't buy in the first place, and your sort of conflicts of interest are really simple and everything. But the challenge there, I think, is that you do lose a kind of privileged access, and there are situations where the pay-to-play thing is just a necessary part of doing this kind of research. You just have to buy in. So with that, I'll just quickly go through. So that was sort of the descriptive world. I'm just going to very quickly kind of give here's my 8 guiding principles for how we should be doing ethical cryptocurrency and blockchain research. And this is just the starting point. This is where I like the conversation to kind of get going from. So the first one is develop a research life cycle. This is common in pharmaceutical research, right? Before you start your research, you say, here's how we're going to take care of our assets. Here's how we're going to do our research, and we're going to chart it all out, and we're going to follow that, right? So this would include, your research life cycle would include, what are you going to do with those tokens when you're done with them? You're going to burn them, you're going to donate them, you're going to whatever, right? Despite the real challenges with IRBs, I think it's really important that we do need to, especially as a community, reach out to these formal ethics organizations and educate them and get them part of our ethics building here. And I think there's actually an opportunity because we have such challenging ethical space here, we can actually do a little ethics innovation here. This is an opportunity for us to take the cool tech we have, the brilliant minds, and all the difficult challenges we have, and actually come up with better ways of doing ethical research and getting those guidelines in place. So another sort of wild number 3 is I think we need to disclose our conflicts of interest, and this is just a simple one that we should all be doing. If you have, I maintain on my website, I have a little disclosure thing that says, this is, roughly how much, crypto I have and the relationships I have with companies and this sort of thing. And that's like a very simple low bar we should be hitting. Number 4, I think we need to consider, whenever possible, using alternative methods of research. So this would be like test nets, making sure in advance you set up your bright line prohibitions. So when you're not going to step over some ethical lines, because as you research, of course, you discover new things, and all of a sudden it's tempting to be like, well, we should follow that up, right? But you might be sort of lulled into making a research ethics mistake. I think we need to protect and dispose of dangerous methods. So the fact that you're doing this research means you need to come up with safeguards to make sure that everything from the police and intelligence agencies don't come by and ask for it, as well as it doesn't get out of misuse by the community themselves, like Ari's example with the sort of that front-running case that their research exposed. We need to disclose software vulnerabilities, even though recognizing that we don't have any good measures for this. I think that's a bare requirement. But software vulnerability disclosure continues to be a persistent problem. Whenever you do pay to play, we should minimize how much you're buying. And finally, I think that it's at this point of our community development, it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to have top-down, formal guidelines. So I think probably the way to go would be bottom-up from the lab. Each lab should be developing their own guidelines around their ethical research and deploying those. And then, some future date, when we have all these wonderful associations and whatnot, we can formalize those at a different level. But I think right now it probably just needs to start from labs. So what I think this all means is that we're actually have a more difficult time with research ethics because these are technologies of per se value. That's value in themselves. And I think that this introduces new ethical risks akin to bio or nanotechnologies. Bio dealing with living things, nano with very small things. We're dealing with valuable things. And so I think that changes the paradigm of what we're researching, and I think it makes issues around research ethics even more difficult. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Quinn. So let's do some questions from folks, and we're going to go to Ellie first.
Thanks. I have lots of questions, but I'll try and keep it to one. So during the DAO exploit, I had DAO tokens. You can all laugh at me behind my back later.
I had
okay, and it was worth it for the drama that ensued, actually. But what I found really interesting about that was, and looking at that Philip Dine survey, they published the replay attack, before it happened, and we don't know if that's what caused it. And I called that out on Twitter and said, hey, what about the human ethics in this as a humanities or, anthropology kind of researcher, and got zero response. And I was appalled that they would publish that in a way that possibly enabled it to happen, unless they were the actual attackers, which is also possible. But yeah, so I suppose the question there around those security things is you want to be able to raise these security faults and issues, but there needs to be an ethics around giving developers a chance to repair things before you go live with it as researchers, which they did not do.
One of these fundamental tensions around, especially this community takes transparency very, very seriously, right? We've seen many of the talks over the last 2 days that really trumpet transparency as being something really important. Well, this is a case where transparency is not always necessarily the right move. Now, for those that don't know, this software vulnerability discussion is one that is a much bigger discussion. And so we've got some standard divisions around what's called full disclosure, which is you find something, you just tell the world right away. Most people today in the computer security community think full disclosure is no good. So now we've emerged this notion of responsible disclosure, which is basically, so I find a bug in Facebook, I go to Facebook, I say, I've got a critical bug. They say, sign this NDA. I sign the NDA. And then there's some negotiated amount of time where they have to fix it. It's like 90 days or something, right? And then they fix it or whatever. And then after 90 days, I publish my article on this, and then I got my, everyone thinks, oh, that's so great, Quinn discovered this thing, and what a good thing, and this sort of thing, but it's also been patched in the meantime. There's tensions there because oftentimes companies don't really want, hackers sniffing around, and so your version of a critical exploit and mine as a crappy company might be two different things, and so I might just refuse to fix it. And so that's when people go, well, I'm going full disclosure. I'm going to let the world know, and you're going to have to suffer the consequences. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, I was wondering, so in a decentralized system, is that a challenge, for example, when you want to do responsible disclosure? Who is responsible for coming up with a solution? And could a system like a Google Zero project exist?
Yeah, I mean, presumably an exploit will originate in one, it'll be this wallet or this, core protocol or something. So I would think, but it's a challenge if there's no one, if there's, many of the entities that are, in our community are very loose. So there's not a lot of, this is a kind of a question of governance too, right? Who do you disclose these things to? I don't know, right?
So do you identify a boundary in the case of these technical bugs from essentially economic or logical bugs? Because if you're exploiting a smart contract that's working as intended, but as intended it works differently than sort of intended in the economic sense, then I feel like you're starting to tread on a line where we get back to the normative questions of the community having the properties discussed in the earlier talk. And it's not that one is right or wrong per se, but there's like this fuzzy line as you transition from an implementation error to you intentionally implemented an algorithm that has a property that maybe you didn't want it to have, but the algorithm was what you specified and it's working as intended from a implementation perspective.
Yeah, that, strictly speaking, I don't think is necessarily a research ethics question, so I'll dodge there. But I do think that this is definitely something that we need to deal with. The DAO being the DAO is a great example of this, right? There's just a tremendous amount of tension around. When I was writing about it, I really didn't even know what to call it. Is it an exploit? Is it an attack? It's not. It depends on how you feel about the politics of it. It's arguably not an attack. It's just a clever guy, making the right decisions or something, right? And so it's a real challenge. And the community came up with, with what we all know what happened. Whether or not that was the right decision is, I don't know.
Honestly, I like the outcome. The fork told us a lot. So one question about ethics is there always a yes? Do I need 3-valued logic to discuss this?
Yeah, I don't think there's simple answers there. I don't think, and I think the way we should approach it rather is to put principles in place so that we can avoid most of those issues. There's always going to be, there'll always be these big momentous cases that we're going to have to deal with of the moment, right? But if we have some, it's like standard, you work in a company, you have a standard risk management, you have a playbook, right? What happens? Well, we just look at the playbook and here's how we can help. These give us some principles as to how we can sort out what we think is the right course of action.
We'll do 2 more questions maybe.
This may go to this slide a little bit. Do you feel like the value of value is appropriately valued in our world?
Is this sort of is this bouncing off sort of Reese's comment about this notion of this oxymoronical.
More about like so like here we're saying like if you're playing with money that's comparable to playing with life. So I kind of wonder if like we as human beings just don't, well, especially in the West, we don't quite understand what money means or like what it could mean to certain people.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the interesting big picture changes that we probably don't talk about enough. We just assume. We have a whole new dimension of our life that has now been made secure or decentralized, or whatever. Money, right? I mean, this is a very profound shift in society. I mean, while we're at it, I think what's interesting is actually, I think crypto is kind of eating the world in this regard, right? Because what's next? Well, voting's next. There's all these really essential parts of who we are as humans that are changing, and I worry about like even just the financialization of these mechanisms, right? It's a real. I mean, these are separate discussions, but I think these are real profound issues. And while I think it's great that I want to support Libra's effort to make remittances cheap, so people can transact around the globe, that's great, right? But I think there's a heap of challenges there as well.
One more question. Go.
It may be the same question here. When you say comparable risks to bio and nanotechnologies, do you mean comparable in size, threatening to humanity as such, or do you mean comparable in kind, so that the risks that we see in these other technologies, are you inviting us to think about the kinds of ethical risks, or are you just saying?
I think both. And so actually, I was having a conversation with Sasha last night about this tension here. Right now, the impact, as Reese was sort of intimating before, the impact is not so big that we're not going to, we don't have crypto too big to fail type of, we're not going to see systemic crashes across entire economies if one cryptocurrency goes out or whatever, right? Of course, the future might be different there. So I do mean it in that regard, but I also actually do think that, and I'll put my philosopher's hat on here, I think we're actually dealing with a shift in ontology. So I think money itself has, and by money I mean actually really value or something, not narrowly defined sense of value. I think that has actually changed. And so, and in the same way that I think biotechnologies, nanotechnologies are ontologically speaking getting at something rather different, right? So it is a sense of a kind. So I think this is a new class, as it were, right? We have biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, and value technologies, for whatever we want to kind of call them.
Great. Thank you. Let's give Quinn a round of applause. Yeah.